Ever since the retirement of Drew Brees after the 2020 NFL season, the New Orleans Saints have had a gaping hole at the most important position in all of football. The Saints have started 6 different quarterbacks since 2021. All of them have underperformed. But 2023 was supposed to be the year where the Saints finally found their quarterback. Because during the offseason, the Saints decided to sign former Raiders quarterback Derek Carr to a 4-year, $150 million contract. But despite a lot of high expectations going into the season, and having the luxury of getting to play in the NFL's weakest division, the Saints are 5-6 and find themselves in second place behind the Atlanta Falcons in the NFC South. The disappointing year has many people expecting the Saints to enter a rebuilding phase, and there has been a long series of events that have led the Saints into this situation. For 15 seasons, Drew Brees was the face of the New Orleans Saints. He led the team to their only Super Bowl victory in franchise history, and at the time of his retirement, he was the NFL's all-time leader in passing yards and passing touchdowns. Father Time started to take its inevitable toll on Brees towards the end of his career. This meant that the Saints had to start acting sooner rather than later to try and find their next quarterback of the future. Organizations that are proactive in replacing their star quarterbacks typically find success. The best examples of this are the Packers going from Brett Favre to Aaron Rodgers, and the 49ers going from Joe Montana to Steve Young. And the Saints were planning on doing the same thing. Former Saints head coach Sean Payton said that New Orleans was ready to take Patrick Mahomes with the 11th pick in the 2017 NFL Draft. He even said that he told Drew Brees on the night of the draft that they were planning on taking Mahomes with their first-round pick. But those plans were shattered when the Kansas City Chiefs traded up to the 10th overall pick and selected Mahomes just 1 pick before the Saints. And I'm sure that all Saints fans collapsed when Sean Payton said this. Transitioning from Drew Brees to Patrick Mahomes would have been a dream scenario for the Saints. This obviously didn't happen, but it was the first sign that the Saints were at least thinking about life after Drew Brees. In week 2 of 2019, Brees suffered a torn UCL in the thumb on his throwing hand and missed the next 5 weeks for the Saints. Teddy Bridgewater started in his place. And at age 26, it looked like this might have been Bridgewater's chance to revive his career. Bridgewater was drafted in the first round by the Minnesota Vikings in 2014. And in 2015, he made the Pro Bowl while leading the Vikings to an 11-5 record. But unfortunately, before the 2016 season, Bridgewater suffered a catastrophic knee injury in practice that nearly ended his career. He didn't play for 2 full seasons, but after a strong 2018 preseason with the Jets, the Saints traded a 3rd-round pick for the former Pro Bowler, which is a relatively high amount to pay for a backup quarterback. But Bridgewater would prove that he was well worth it, because while Brees was injured, Bridgewater led the Saints to a perfect 5-0 record in those games and threw 9 touchdowns to just 2 interceptions. Bridgewater's performance meant that he was going to get the opportunity to start somewhere, but the question was if it was going to be with the Saints. Ultimately, Brees signed a 2-year extension heading into the 2020 season, and the Saints decided to let Teddy Bridgewater walk. And honestly, this was a pretty good choice for the Saints, because Bridgewater has never panned out as a starting quarterback and has now been on 4 different teams in 4 years. After the departure of Teddy Bridgewater before the 2020 season, the Saints signed former number 1 overall pick Jameis Winston. Winston was coming off of a season where he threw for over 5,100 yards and 30 touchdowns, but he also threw a ridiculous 30 interceptions to go along with it. Interceptions were always Jameis's biggest issue in the NFL, but New Orleans seemed like the perfect place for Winston to resurrect his career. He was going to learn behind one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history, and if he played well, there was a chance that he could be the heir to the throne in New Orleans whenever Brees decided to retire. In week 10 of the 2020 season, Drew Brees was not able to play in the second half of the game versus the 49ers after he suffered an injury to his ribs. Jameis Winston came in and the Saints got the victory. Later on, it was revealed that Brees suffered a collapsed lung and 11 fractured ribs and was placed on the injured reserve list, meaning he was going to miss the team's next 4 weeks. This seemed seemed like it would be the perfect chance for the Saints to see what they had with Jameis Winston. But the team instead elected to start Taysom Hill at quarterback. And while Hill didn't play terribly in 4 games as the starter, nobody truly viewed him as the team's potential franchise quarterback. My theory is that the Saints and Sean Payton decided they wanted to hide Jameis Winston, mainly because Winston was set to be a free agent after the season. And if Jameis came in for those 4 games and looked incredible, the Saints would probably have to try and outbid teams with much more cap space in order to re-sign Jameis Winston. Brees came back in week 15 and the Saints ended up making the playoffs, but ultimately losing in the divisional round to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And while Brees never made his retirement plans official, it was so obvious that this was going to be his last game as an NFL player. During the final moments of the game, Brees can be seen having a talk with Jameis Winston on the sideline. The legend of the story is that Brees told Jameis Winston, "This is your team now." And I'm not great at reading lips, but I thought it was certainly worth noting that Brees is clearly having a serious conversation with Winston in the final moments of his NFL career. And I wouldn't be surprised if Brees, who was clearly emotional at the time, said something along those lines to Jameis. A few months later, Brees officially retired at the age of 42, which meant that for the first time in 15 seasons, the Saints would have a new starting quarterback in week 1. And in the offseason, the Saints re-signed Jameis Winston to a 2-year deal and later announced that he would be their week 1 starter heading into the 2021 season. The Jameis Winston era in New Orleans started off hot in week 1, as Jameis Winston threw for 5 touchdowns and posted a passer rating of 130.8. And the Saints destroyed Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers by a score of 38-3. It looked like Jameis had made the improvements that he needed to make in order to become a franchise quarterback. In 7 games as the starter, Jameis Winston threw for 14 touchdowns to just 3 interceptions and posted a 102.8 passer rating, which was by far his career high. And most importantly, the Saints were 5-2 in those games. But unfortunately, Jameis Winston suffered a torn ACL in week 8 against his former team, putting an end to his revival season. The Saints then bounced between Trevor Siemian, Taysom Hill, and Ian Book in the final weeks of the year, and the 4 of them would go a combined 4-6 to finish the season, putting the Saints' total record at 9-8. After the 2021 season, longtime head coach Sean Payton announced his retirement, which was yet another big change for the Saints. But rather than chasing after big names like Brian Daboll or Mike McDaniel, the Saints decided to promote from within and gave their defensive coordinator Dennis Allen the opportunity to become the team's next head coach. The Saints did this as an effort to smoothly transition after the departure of Sean Payton, because the team was not planning on rebuilding. Allen had previous head coaching experience with the Raiders from 2012 to 2014. He finished his time as the Raiders head coach with an abysmal 8-28 record and was fired a quarter of the way through his 3rd season. But now he was getting another chance with the Saints, who certainly have a much better team than those Raiders teams did. During the offseason, the Saints were pursuing multiple big-name veteran quarterbacks who were on the trade market: Russell Wilson and Deshaun Watson. After a strange fallout between Russell Wilson and the Seahawks that slowly unraveled for years, Wilson became available for trade. But what made the situation even more interesting was that Wilson had a no-trade clause in his contract. Therefore, he had all the leverage and could decide what team he wanted to be traded to. Reportedly, Wilson was willing to waive his no-trade clause for the Giants, Broncos, and the Saints. But as we know, Russell Wilson ended up being traded to the Denver Broncos. Then there was Deshaun Watson. The wildly talented young quarterback wanted to be traded from the Houston Texans. There was a lot to consider with Watson, though. He was dealing with 26 sexual misconduct allegations and didn't play at all during 2021 because the Texans decided it would be best for Watson to stay away from the team. Despite all of the baggage that would come with trading for Watson, there were still multiple teams who were interested. One of those teams happened to be the New Orleans Saints. In fact, the Saints met with Deshaun Watson multiple times and were at one point considered to be the favorites to acquire the troubled Texans Texans quarterback. But Watson surprisingly waived his no-trade clause for the Cleveland Browns after they offered him a 5-year, $230 million contract that was fully guaranteed. So the Saints missed out on yet another opportunity for a quarterback. However, it potentially was a blessing in disguise, as Russell Wilson has not looked the same since joining the Broncos, and Deshaun Watson has only played in 12 games over the past 2 years for the Browns. But after their failed attempts at trading for a quarterback, the Saints started Jameis Winston again in Week 1 of 2022. But unfortunately, Jameis Winston would turn back to his turnover-prone ways, as in Weeks 2 and 3, he had a combined 5 interceptions and a passer rating of 66.3. And after suffering an injury in Week 3, Jameis Winston was replaced by Andy Dalton for the rest of the season. Dalton, who is now in his 12th season in the NFL, was certainly not the long-term answer at quarterback for the Saints, and they finished the year with the 7-10 record, which meant that New Orleans would have to wait yet another year to find a true replacement for Drew Brees. At the start of the offseason, the New Orleans Saints were expected to pursue a veteran quarterback, and immediately, when the Raiders released Derek Carr, the Saints signed him to a 4-year deal worth up to $150 million, making him the 10th highest paid quarterback in the league. Throughout his time with the Raiders, Carr put up some solid numbers, but he didn't have much success, as he went 63-79 as the starter, and didn't win a playoff game during his 9 seasons in silver and black. But now on an offense with weapons like Chris Olave and Alvin Kamara, it was supposed to be Carr's time to shine in New Orleans. But as we know, that simply has not been the case. And if you look at per 17 game averages, Andy Dalton's 2022 season had a better completion percentage, a better passer rating, and more touchdowns than Derek Carr this year. In comparison to the rest of the NFL, the Saints passing offense ranks 11th in passing yards and 18th in passing touchdowns, which is similar to 2022 when they ranked 16th in both passing yards and passing touchdowns. To me, it looks like the Saints paid $150 million to a slightly younger version of Andy Dalton. But this is what the Saints wanted. After Brees left, the Saints still wanted to win. They did not want to try and rebuild for the future. They believed that they still had the pieces in place to be a contending team, but only if they found the right quarterback. However, the fact of the matter is, they haven't found the right quarterback. In my opinion, the Saints need to do 2 things. First, they need to move on from Dennis Allen as their head coach. He already was proven to be a terrible head coach in Oakland, and now he's 12-16 in the first 2 years as the Saints head coach. He's just one of those guys that's simply better off as a defensive coordinator. Secondly, they need to draft a quarterback with their first-round pick this year. Currently, the Saints have the 12th overall pick in the NFL draft, and if that holds, they will be in a decent position to either draft a quarterback at 12 or to trade up and draft a quarterback with a higher pick. As of right now, I think they should be eyeing Jaden Daniels from LSU, who is currently having an incredible year and at the moment is projected to be a mid to late first round pick. And it would be a cool story for Jaden Daniels to go from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, although there's still a lot to shake out as far as the draft goes. But there is no excuse for the Saints to struggle this much on offense. Changes absolutely need to be made in New Orleans. They need to stop being stubborn and realize that the era of Drew Brees and Sean Payton is over, and it's time to start planning for success over the next 10 to 15 years, rather than thinking this team should still be in a win now mode when it's clearly not working. Let me know in the comments what you think the Saints should do going forward. And thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like and hit that subscribe button, as it will go a long way in helping me grow this channel for you. And once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.